I had always been told not to go near the old Henderson property, a crumbling Victorian house at the edge of Willow Creek where the forest grew thick and uninviting, casting shadows that felt alive. Everyone in town whispered about her, Karen, the woman who once lived there and vanished decades ago, leaving behind nothing but rumors, fear, and stories too dark to repeat in polite company. They said she was a mother, but no one ever saw her children. Others claimed she was a witch who could curse you with a single glance, a bitter soul who prowled the hollows at night, waiting for someone foolish enough to wander too close. I never believed it, until the night I had no choice but to cross the property's threshold. It happened after a late shift at the gas station, the air so thick with mist that the road back home seemed to disappear. My car sputtered to a stop right near the old Henderson house, dead as if the engine knew something I didn't. My phone had no signal, and the sound of crickets seemed to stop all at once as I stood on the cracked asphalt, staring through the fog at that wretched house. The windows glowed faintly, like dying embers, though the place had been abandoned for decades. I should have stayed on the road, walked toward town, but something pulled me toward it. A whisper in my head, faint and soft, calling my name in a voice that sounded like my mother's, though I knew it wasn't possible. As I walked up the rotting steps, the door creaked open slowly, as though it had been expecting me, revealing a black void inside that seemed to suck in the faint moonlight. The air inside was heavy, smelling of mildew and something worse, something that turned my stomach. I tried to turn back, but the door slammed shut behind me, and a voice, soft, motherly, echoed through the house. "Welcome home, my dear." My legs moved against my will as I stumbled through the dusty halls lined with portraits. Each painting showed a child, hollow-eyed and pale, their faces twisted in sorrow. I wanted to run, but the house wouldn't let me. The floors groaned underfoot, the walls seemed to pulse like living skin, and shadows darted in the corners of my vision. I stopped when I reached a room at the end of the hall. Inside was a rocking chair, and in it sat Karen, or what was left of her. Her skin was dry and cracked like old parchment. Her hair hung in brittle strands around her face, and her mouth, oh God, her mouth, was stretched wide in an eternal grin, showing teeth too sharp, too long, like jagged knives. She rocked slowly, her sunken eyes locked on me, and she spoke without moving her lips. "You've come for the children, haven't you?" I didn't know what she meant, but before I could respond, I heard it, the faint giggling of children, echoing through the house. I turned to see small figures darting through the doorway, crawling on hands and knees, their movements jerky and unnatural. They surrounded me, their faces covered in burlap, giggling and whispering in voices that made my ears ring. Karen rose from the chair, her bones cracking with every step as she pointed a gnarled finger at me. "A mother never forgets her children," she rasped, and suddenly, the burlap masks began to fall away, revealing faces I recognized. My younger brother who drowned when I was 10, my cousin who disappeared in the woods years ago, friends who had died in accidents long forgotten. Their skin was pale, their eyes black pits of endless sorrow as they whispered in unison, "Stay with us." I screamed, stumbling backward, but the children crawled closer, their hands cold and clammy as they grabbed my legs, pulling me toward Karen. The room seemed to melt away as the walls dripped like tar, and the floor opened beneath me into a dark pit where something enormous and writhing waited below. Karen loomed over me now, her grin splitting her face in two as she whispered, "A mother always finds more." I fought against the grip of the children, their nails digging into my skin, but I was losing strength as their voices filled my head. "Stay, stay, stay." I don't know how I broke free, but I ran, my mind a blur as I stumbled through endless halls that twisted and changed, leading me back to her again and again. I don't know how long I was in there. Time felt wrong, like it stretched and folded in on itself. Finally, I found a door, rotten and splintered but open just enough for me to squeeze through. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing in the dew-soaked grass outside as the sun rose in the distance. I turned to look at the house one last time, but it was gone, replaced by an empty, lifeless field. I thought I was free, but I hear them now every night. The giggling starts in the walls of my apartment, growing louder as the shadows stretch longer. Sometimes, I see Karen's face in the mirror, grinning that jagged grin. Other times, I hear her voice in my dreams. A mother never forgets her children. I know it's only a matter of time before they come for me again, Karen and her children, because I didn't escape. You never escape her. She waits, patient as death itself, for the next poor soul to wander too close. Maybe it'll be you. I don't know why I'm writing this down. It feels like a confession to something I don't fully understand. But I need someone, anyone, to know the truth about what happened to me. It all started on an ordinary Tuesday when I moved into a small, run-down apartment complex at the edge of the city, desperate to save money after losing my job. The landlord, a wiry man with an unsettling grin, handed me the keys with an odd warning. Don't mind the woman in 6B. She's difficult. I thought nothing of it. A difficult neighbor was the least of my problems. My unit, number 6A, was tiny and smelled faintly of mildew, the kind of smell that seeps into your clothes and never leaves. I spent the day unpacking, but as night fell, I noticed something strange. The sound of faint, persistent knocking. At first, it was just a dull tap, tap, tap coming from the shared wall between my unit and 6B, and I assumed it was the neighbor moving furniture or hammering something. It went on for hours, though relentless and rhythmic, until I finally slammed my hand against the wall and shouted, "Keep it down!" The knocking stopped instantly, and for a moment, there was silence, until a woman's voice, low and gravelly, whispered through the wall, "You shouldn't have done that." My heart skipped a beat. I froze, waiting, listening. Nothing. I tried to convince myself I had imagined it, that maybe the stress of moving had gotten to me, and went to bed with every light on. That night, I woke up to the sound of knocking again. Not from the wall this time, but from the closet door. I sat up, my pulse pounding in my ears. The knocking was louder now, aggressive, as if something inside the closet was trying to get out. I grabbed my phone and shined its flashlight toward the closet door, my shaking hand barely able to hold it steady. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice hoarse. The knocking stopped. For a long moment, I stared, waiting for something, anything, to happen, but the silence was suffocating. Then, slowly, the closet door creaked open, and for the briefest second, I saw her. A woman standing in the shadows, her thin face twisted into a scowl, her eyes dark and sunken like twin black holes. She pointed at me with one long, gnarled finger and hissed, "You don't belong here." I screamed and scrambled out of bed, fleeing the apartment without looking back. I spent the rest of the night in my car, shaking and unable to sleep. When morning came, I convinced myself it had been a dream, stress, exhaustion, a trick of the mind. I went back to my apartment, determined to brush it off. But when I stepped inside, the air felt heavier, the light dimmer, as though the whole unit was slowly rotting. I avoided the closet and tried to go about my day, but every time I passed the shared wall with 6B, I felt eyes on me, like something was watching from the other side. That night, the knocking started again, louder this time, coming from every wall, every corner of the room. I could hear her voice whispering just below the noise, "Let me in, let me in, let me in." I covered my ears and screamed, but it didn't stop. Desperate, I ran to 6B and pounded on the door, shouting for her to stop. The hallway was freezing, my breath visible in the dim light. After what felt like an eternity, the door slowly creaked open, revealing an apartment that looked like it had been abandoned for decades. Walls covered in grime, furniture draped in dusty sheets, and a faint smell of rot hanging in the air. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response, but in the corner of the room, I saw her, Karen. She was crouched in the shadows, her thin limbs twisted at unnatural angles, her face barely visible beneath her stringy, matted hair. She grinned, an impossibly wide grin that stretched her face like a mask, and whispered, "You shouldn't have come here." She lunged at me, her fingers clawing through the air as I stumbled backward and slammed the door shut. I ran back to my apartment, barricading the door with anything I could find, but it didn't matter. Karen was everywhere now. Her whispers seeped through the walls. Her shadow stretched across the floor no matter where I stood. I saw her face in the windows, her grin in the mirror, her voice in my ears, always saying the same thing. "You don't belong here. Let me in." Sleep became impossible. I couldn't eat, couldn't think, couldn't escape her. I tried calling the landlord, but when he picked up, he just said, "I warned you," and hung up. I tried leaving the apartment, but the door wouldn't open. No matter how hard I pulled, no matter how much I screamed, it was like the apartment had swallowed me whole. The knocking got louder, the whispers became screams, and Karen's figure appeared closer and closer until she was standing right at the edge of my bed, staring down at me with those hollow eyes. I don't remember when I gave up. Maybe it was when I realized no one could hear me, or when I saw my reflection in the mirror and noticed Karen's shadow standing behind me. She doesn't knock anymore. She doesn't need to. She's here now, inside the walls, inside my mind, watching and waiting. If you're reading this, if you ever find yourself in an apartment next to a woman they call difficult, get out. Don't ignore the knocking. Don't open the closet. And whatever you do, don't let her in. Because once Karen finds you, she never lets go. It began when I moved into the small apartment on Oak Ridge Street, an old building from the 1920s with pipes that rattled and walls so thin you could hear your neighbors breathe. It wasn't much, but it was cheap, and after losing my job, cheap was all I could afford. The landlady, Mrs. Burrows, was an ancient woman with cataract-clouded eyes who didn't smile much. But before handing me the keys, she hesitated and muttered, "Don't pay her any mind. She'll leave you alone if you ignore her." I didn't ask who she was. I figured the woman was senile or trying to scare me for some odd reason. So I brushed it off and settled into my new life. But from the very first night, I knew something was wrong. As I lay in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, I heard faint scratching, like fingernails dragging across the wall behind my headboard. It was slow, deliberate, as though whoever or whatever it was wanted me to hear it. I banged on the wall, assuming it was a mouse or some other pest, but the scratching stopped instantly. Then, a whisper came, soft and cold, almost tickling my ear. "Do you mind?" I jumped out of bed, my heart pounding, but the room was empty, silent except for the hum of the old radiator. I didn't sleep much that night, and in the morning, I convinced myself it was just a bad dream brought on by stress. Days passed and things grew worse. Objects would move when I wasn't looking. My keys on the counter 1 minute, in the middle of the floor the next. My coat would swing on its hook as though someone had just brushed past it. I started hearing footsteps at odd hours, heavy and deliberate, pacing back and forth just outside my door. But every time I checked, the hallway was empty. One night, I woke to find my bedroom door wide open, though I knew I'd locked it. The whisper came again, closer this time. "You're in my spot." I spun around, searching the shadows, and that's when I saw her, Karen, standing in the far corner of the room, just out of reach of the moonlight. Her figure was wrong, elongated somehow, her head tilted too far to the side as if her neck had been broken. Her hair hung in greasy clumps over her face, but I could still see her mouth, an awful, jagged grin that split her pale face in two. She didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, staring at me with hollow eyes that seemed to suck in the darkness. I froze, too terrified to scream, too paralyzed to move, until the whisper came again, dripping with malice. "You'll leave soon. They always do." Then, as suddenly as she appeared, she was gone. I sat in the corner of my bed until sunrise, clutching a baseball bat I found in the closet, but daylight brought me no comfort. The scratches appeared next. Long, deep gouges in the walls, the floors, even the ceiling, always forming words I didn't understand. Jagged symbols that burned when I looked at them too long. I started hearing her more clearly, her voice coming from the pipes, from behind the walls, from under the floorboards. She would hum softly, a tuneless melody that followed me wherever I went. I called the landlady to complain, but her answer chilled me to the bone. "Oh, it's Karen again," she said matter-of-factly, as though I'd mentioned a leaky faucet. She doesn't like sharing her space. Best you leave." I demanded answers, but Mrs. Burrows only said that Karen was the first tenant in the building, back when it was newly built, and that she never left, even after death. I didn't believe her at first, but Karen made sure I learned the truth. She grew bolder, no longer content to linger in the corners of my vision. She would stand at the foot of my bed at night, grinning, whispering things I couldn't understand, her voice low and slithering like worms crawling into my ears. She wanted me gone, but I had nowhere to go. Every night, the air grew colder, and her presence pressed down on me like a weight I couldn't escape. One night, as I lay trembling under the covers, I felt her crawl onto the bed. The mattress sagged under her weight, and the stench of rot filled my nose. I didn't dare open my eyes, but I could feel her face hovering inches from mine, her breath icy and sour. "You're still here," she hissed, and then I felt her hand, a bony, claw-like hand, brush my cheek. I screamed and bolted for the door, but it wouldn't open. I turned to see her standing in front of me, taller than before, her head lolling unnaturally to one side as her grin stretched wider, splitting the skin of her cheeks. "You can't leave," she said, her voice layered with dozens of others, all of them whispering in unison. "You belong to me now." I don't remember how I got out. I think I must have blacked out from terror. When I came to, I was sitting on the curb outside the building, my clothes soaked in sweat and my hands bleeding from clawing at the door. I never went back inside, not even to grab my belongings. I stayed with a friend across town, trying to convince myself it had all been a psychotic break, a trick of my mind, but Karen didn't let me forget. The scratching started again, this time at my friend's place. I would wake up to find those same symbols carved into the walls. My belongings moved, my name whispered in the dead of night. I saw her reflection in mirrors, standing behind me, grinning. I left town after that, driving for hours until I was too exhausted to keep going. But I know she's still with me. I hear her humming when the nights are quiet, and sometimes, when I close my eyes, I feel the weight of her hand on my chest. I don't think she'll ever let me go. Maybe she's waiting for the day I break, the day I finally stop running, the day I give in to her. And when that happens, I wonder, will she move on to someone else? Or will I become just another whisper in the walls? Another tenant who never leaves? If you ever hear her voice, do you mind? Don't answer. Don't look at her. Don't stay. Just run. But no matter how far you go, she'll find you. She always does. I had heard the rumors about the woman who lived in the old house at the edge of Blackwood Hollow. Rumors that kept even the bravest souls at bay, murmurs of something unholy that lurked behind her unsettling smile. Everyone in town called her Karen, though no one knew her real name, nor did anyone dare ask. Her house was a relic of something ancient, with walls that seemed to breathe and windows that reflected only darkness, even under the brightest sun. I never believed in ghost stories, and I certainly didn't believe in the ominous tales about Karen. How she could appear anywhere, staring with her soulless eyes, demanding things you didn't understand, taking things you didn't want to give. That was until I crossed her path on a cold October night, when the fog choked the streets and shadows stretched longer than they should have. I was walking home from my shift at the diner, annoyed that I had to work late again, when I spotted her across the street. Her silhouette was unmistakable, a rigid posture, her head tilted just slightly too far to one side, and that pale face staring directly at me. I quickened my pace, but her footsteps echoed louder, matching my every move. I glanced over my shoulder, and she was still there, grinning now, a smile too wide, showing teeth too sharp. I ducked into an alley, praying she wouldn't follow, but as I turned the corner, I froze. She was already there, waiting, her figure distorted under the dim, flickering light. "You've been ignoring me," she hissed, though her lips never moved. Her voice was like nails dragging over glass. I couldn't speak. My throat felt like it was filled with sand. I turned and ran, sprinting through the maze of alleys, but every corner I turned led me right back to her. Her presence was suffocating, like she was growing larger, towering over me, her eyes burning holes into my soul. I screamed, and then everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying in her living room, bound to a chair, surrounded by strange symbols carved into the floor. The walls seemed to ripple, like they were alive, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. She stood before me, holding a cracked mirror. "Look at yourself," she whispered, though her voice came from everywhere at once. I didn't want to, but my head turned against my will, my reflection staring back, except it wasn't me. The face in the mirror was hollow, twisted, with Karen's grin stretching across it. "You're mine now," she said, and my reflection began to laugh, low, guttural, growing louder until it filled the room. I thrashed against the ropes, but they dug deeper into my skin, as if they were alive, tightening with every heartbeat. The symbols on the floor began to glow, and the house trembled, the sound of countless whispers filling my ears. Then, she stepped closer, her face inches from mine. Her eyes were empty voids, pulling me in, swallowing me whole. I screamed again, but it was drowned out by the sound of her laughter, an endless, ear-splitting cackle that rattled my bones. I don't remember what happened next, but when I opened my eyes, I was standing in the middle of Blackwood Hollow, the fog thicker than ever. The house was gone, replaced by a crater of scorched earth. My body felt wrong, like I didn't fit in my own skin. People stared as I walked back into town, their eyes widening in horror before they turned and ran. I didn't understand why until I caught my reflection in a store window. It was her face, Karen's face, staring back at me, grinning that impossible grin. I screamed, but it wasn't my voice that came out. It was hers. I've been trapped ever since, wandering the streets, unable to sleep, unable to escape. Every mirror I pass shows me the truth. I am Karen now, and she is me. They say her spirit is cursed to find a new host every few years, and I was just the latest fool to cross her path. I see people whisper when I pass, mothers clutching their children tighter, doors locking as I approach. They all know what I am, though they don't say it out loud. And every night, as I stare into the darkness, I hear her laughter echoing inside my mind, promising that one day soon, I'll pass the curse to someone else. Maybe it'll be you. After all, she always finds a way. It started when I moved into the new house, a quiet suburban neighborhood where the houses were packed close together, but the air always felt too still. The kind of place that seemed picture-perfect, where the grass was green and everyone smiled at each other with hollow politeness. My wife and I had been looking for a fresh start, a place to settle down away from the chaos of the city. The house itself was lovely, though old, with a lot of character. But I noticed something odd on the first day we moved in. A small, locked door in the basement, covered in layers of dust, its edges chipped and cracked. I asked the previous owners about it, but they brushed it off. Just a storage room, nothing special, they said, their smiles strained. But I could feel the tension in their voices, the subtle shift in their eyes. There was something they weren't telling me. Over the next few weeks, as I unpacked boxes and settled into our new life, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching me. At night, when the house was quiet and my wife was asleep, I'd hear the creak of floorboards from the basement, a whispering sound, almost too faint to hear, but there. I chalked it up to the house settling, or maybe just my imagination playing tricks on me. But it kept happening, every night without fail. One evening, when my wife went to visit her sister, I decided to investigate. I couldn't stand the unease anymore. I grabbed the flashlight, made my way down to the basement, and stood before the locked door. My heart thudded in my chest as I examined the old brass knob, the rusted keyhole. Something inside me was pulling me toward it, urging me to open it, to uncover whatever secret it held. I found an old key buried in the bottom of one of the boxes in the attic. It fit perfectly. The door creaked open, and the smell of mold and stale air hit me like a wall. The basement was colder than the rest of the house, the shadows in the corners thick and suffocating. At first, I saw nothing but the usual piles of old furniture and forgotten items. But as I stepped further in, I noticed something strange. A small wooden chair sitting in the center of the room, its surface scuffed and worn. My flashlight flickered. Then I saw her. Standing in the far corner, barely visible in the shadows, was a woman. Her face was obscured by long, matted hair, but her posture was unnerving, unnaturally still, as if she were waiting. The air grew heavy. I could feel her presence, thick and suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling despite myself. The woman didn't respond. She didn't move, didn't acknowledge me in any way, but I could feel her eyes on me, cold and calculating. The silence stretched on until I couldn't bear it anymore. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to get out of that basement, but my legs felt like they were rooted to the floor. Then she spoke. Her voice was quiet, a dry rasp that sent shivers crawling down my spine. "You shouldn't have come here." I froze. My breath caught in my throat. Slowly, the woman raised her hand and pointed directly at me, her fingers long and skeletal. "You're mine now," she whispered, her voice like the rustling of dead leaves. Before I could react, the basement door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. I spun around, my pulse racing. The door was gone, vanished as if it had never existed. I was trapped in the room with her. My flashlight flickered one last time and died, plunging the room into absolute darkness. The only thing I could hear now was the sound of my own breathing, shallow and rapid. Then the whispering began. 1,000 voices, all around me, murmuring in languages I couldn't understand. Each whisper felt like it was crawling under my skin, invading my thoughts, my very soul. "You're mine now," the woman repeated, her voice now a chorus, the words swirling around me like a storm. I stumbled back, trying to make sense of the scene, but the shadows around me were closing in, pressing against me with an invisible weight. I reached for my phone in my pocket, hoping to call for help, but it was dead. No signal, no connection to the outside world. My heart pounded in my chest, my hands trembling as I felt around in the dark for any escape. But it was hopeless. She was everywhere now, her presence consuming the room. Then the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I could feel her in front of me, though I couldn't see her, her cold breath on my neck. "You should have left when you had the chance," she whispered, and I felt her fingers brush against my cheek. My skin crawled. Desperation surged through me, and I screamed, trying to force my way through the suffocating darkness. Suddenly, there was a loud crack, like the sound of bones breaking, and the basement was flooded with an eerie, sickly light. I turned toward the source, and there she was, fully revealed for the first time. Her face was a twisted mess of scars, her eyes wide and empty, black holes where her pupils should have been. Her mouth was stretched into a grotesque, inhuman grin, too wide for any human to make. She lunged at me, her mouth opening impossibly wide, and I felt her cold fingers wrap around my throat, choking the air from my lungs. "You're mine now," she repeated, her voice now an echo, reverberating through the room, through my mind. Everything went black. When I woke up, I was back in my bed. The morning sunlight filtered through the curtains, and everything felt normal again. For a moment, I wondered if it had all been a nightmare, a product of stress and exhaustion. But then, I looked down at my hands. They were covered in old, dried blood. And in the corner of my room, in the shadows, I saw her standing again. The woman from the basement. She was smiling, that grotesque, inhuman smile. "You're mine now," she whispered, and I knew it was too late. I was never getting out of this house. I never believed in ghosts or curses or anything remotely supernatural until I moved into that house. The one everyone in town whispered about but refused to talk openly about. A place so soaked in mystery and dread that locals avoided the road it stood on entirely. I'd just taken a job in a small, dying town after my divorce, desperate for a fresh start and a cheap place to live, which is exactly what I got when I stumbled upon the decrepit old Victorian house at the edge of town. Abandoned but still somehow waiting for me. The realtor, an anxious man who constantly checked over his shoulder, handed me the keys without much fuss but muttered something as he left. something I only half heard at the time. The house doesn't like her. I shrugged it off as nonsense, convinced that small towns were full of strange people with stranger tales. The house was cold, impossibly so, and though the floors creaked underfoot and the wallpaper peeled like old skin, I felt a twisted comfort being alone in a place no one else wanted. It didn't take long for things to go wrong. On the second night, I woke to the sound of faint knocking, rhythmic and distant, like someone tapping on the farthest wall of the house. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just an old pipe or the wind, but then I heard a voice, sharp and condescending, calling from the hallway outside my bedroom. "Are you deaf? I'm talking to you." My blood froze, and I sat up, staring at the door. I lived alone. I didn't move, barely dared to breathe as the voice continued, closer now, almost mocking. "Don't make me come in there." I grabbed the lamp beside my bed and bolted for the hallway, expecting to find some intruder playing a cruel joke, but the corridor was empty. Yet, something felt off. The hallway was longer than I remembered, far longer. Doors that I hadn't noticed before lined the walls, and though they were all shut tight, I felt eyes staring at me from the other side, watching, waiting. At the end of the impossibly stretched hallway stood a woman, a Karen, though not the suburban kind you'd expect. Her figure was tall and stiff, her head twitching slightly, as though her neck couldn't hold it straight. Her face was a mask of rage, shallow wrinkles etched deep from perpetual scowling, her eyes burning with a light that didn't belong to this world. She jabbed a finger at me. "This is my house," she snarled, her voice layered with something ancient and awful, as though dozens of voices spoke in unison. "You don't belong here." I blinked, and she was gone. I ran back to my room, locking the door, but the hallway seemed to echo with her laughter, a low, cruel sound that followed me into my dreams. That was the first night I met her, but it wasn't the last. Over the next few days, the house warped into something unrecognizable. The doors in the hallway multiplied, twisting the layout of the house so that I couldn't tell where I was or where I was going. I'd turn a corner and find myself in a room I'd never seen before, rooms filled with rotting furniture and mirrors that reflected someone else's face, someone who looked like me but wasn't me. And always, in the distance, Karen stood watching, her figure growing darker, her eyes hollowing into pits that swallowed all light. She didn't let me sleep. Every night, she whispered from the other side of the door, "Get out before I make you stay." But I couldn't leave, not because I didn't want to, but because the house wouldn't let me. The front door was gone, replaced by a wall that pulsed like it was alive. Windows showed nothing but blackness, and no matter how far I ran, I always ended up back in that endless hallway with its countless doors. One day, as I explored, I made the mistake of opening one of the doors. Inside was a room bathed in flickering red light, and Karen was there, hunched over something on the floor, whispering to herself. Her head snapped up when she saw me, her mouth stretching into an impossible grin. "I told you not to open the doors," she hissed, her voice slithering into my ears and filling my mind like smoke. She stood and stepped toward me, her limbs jerking like a marionette as she moved, her grin widening until it split the sides of her face. I slammed the door and ran, but it didn't matter. Her laughter followed me, echoing off the walls. I tried everything to escape. I screamed until my throat was raw, tore at the walls until my fingers bled, and begged the house to let me go. But Karen was always there, mocking me, watching me, her voice taunting me in every shadow, every creak of the floorboards. "You're one of us now. I don't know how long I've been here. Time doesn't work the same way anymore. The sun never rises, the clocks don't tick, and the house stretches on forever." I've stopped trying to count the doors, but sometimes when I pass one, I hear voices, other voices, crying, pleading, screaming for help. I think they're the others who came before me, people who couldn't escape Karen's house, people who stayed too long. Last night, she finally came into my room. She stood at the foot of my bed, her head lolling to one side, her arms outstretched as though inviting me to come closer. Her voice was soft this time, almost sweet. "It's time to join the family." I don't know what she meant, but I'm too tired to keep running. I think I'm starting to see things her way. Maybe I do belong here. Maybe I always have. If you ever see that house on the edge of town, if you ever feel its pull, don't go inside. Don't listen to the whispers. Don't open the doors. And if you see her, Karen, don't look her in the eyes, because once she sees you, she never lets you go. I moved into the old house at the edge of town a month ago. A deal too good to resist. Too perfect, really. The neighbors barely spoke. The air was thick with silence. And the house itself had the kind of history people love to forget. But I didn't care. I was looking for a fresh start. A clean slate far from the noise and chaos of the city. The house was enormous, old, and filled with creaky floorboards, dust, and a strange smell that I couldn't quite place. It wasn't the usual musty scent of forgotten rooms, but something more like rotting. Still, I was happy to be away from my past, so I shoved aside my unease. It wasn't until I met Karen that everything started to unravel. Karen was my neighbor, a woman in her late 50s, with pale skin, sharp eyes, and a mouth that never seemed to stop. She was the type of woman who demanded attention the moment she walked into a room, but it wasn't her presence that unnerved me. It was the way she looked at me, like she knew something I didn't. I first met her on a quiet evening as I sat on the front porch, enjoying the rare bit of peace I had. Karen wandered over, her heels clicking on the sidewalk with a rhythm that felt far too deliberate, and greeted me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You must be the new tenant," she said, her voice crisp, with just the right amount of sweet to make you uncomfortable. I nodded, trying to be polite, but there was something about her that sent a chill down my spine. "Nice to meet you. I'm Karen. You'll be seeing a lot of me." She spoke with the kind of certainty that made it sound less like a greeting and more like a warning. Over the next few weeks, Karen showed up at my door several times, always with some excuse, just checking in, offering advice, wanting to chat. The visits felt casual at first, harmless even, but they soon began to feel like a ritual. She would appear unannounced, her eyes glinting with a strange mixture of pity and superiority. It wasn't long before I began noticing the oddities. Small things at first: Karen's constant presence in the neighborhood, her watchful gaze whenever I came or went, the way she would smile just a little too wide, just a little too long. She started leaving strange gifts on my doorstep. Old, yellowed postcards, wilted flowers, and once, a dusty black book wrapped in twine. It was the book that made me finally take notice. I tried to open it, but the pages were blank, except for a single line on the first page. "You are mine now." That was the moment I realized something was horribly wrong. I tried to distance myself from Karen, but she only grew more persistent. She'd show up at odd hours, knocking on my door, standing on my porch with a smile that looked more like a snarl. It was like she had a magnetic pull, one that was impossible to resist. I started avoiding her, staying inside, locking my doors, but she always knew when I was home. She'd stand outside, staring at the windows, her figure a constant presence. Then the whispers began. At night, when I was lying in bed, I would hear soft murmurs through the walls, so faint I thought I was imagining it. But it was real. I heard Karen's voice, low, soothing, but with an edge of something darker. The words didn't make sense, like broken pieces of a sentence, but they were always the same. "You are mine now. I'll never let you go." Couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. It felt like I was being suffocated, like Karen was inside my head, slowly taking over every thought. And it didn't end there. One night, unable to take it any longer, I decided to confront her. I went to her house, my heart pounding in my chest, each step a heavy thud in the silence of the night. The house was dark, the windows empty. When I knocked on the door, I didn't expect it to open so easily. The door creaked open, and there she was, standing in the doorway, her smile unnervingly wide. "I've been waiting for you," Karen said, her voice thick with satisfaction. "You've come to understand now, haven't you?" I didn't speak, couldn't. My throat was dry, my body frozen in place. Karen stepped aside, gesturing for me to enter, but something stopped me. Behind her, in the dim light, I saw a room filled with old photographs of me. Hundreds of pictures of me from different angles at different times, some taken through the windows of my own home. "You've been watching me?" I whispered, the realization hitting me like a punch. Karen's smile only grew wider, her eyes gleaming with something dark and twisted. "Oh, sweetie, I haven't just been watching you," she said, her voice almost affectionate now. "I've been preparing you. You're mine, and I've waited so long for you to see it. But you weren't ready. Not until now." Before I could react, Karen stepped forward, and everything around me seemed to distort. The room stretched, the walls seemed to close in, and the air grew thick, like I was drowning in it. My heart raced, and I felt an overwhelming sense of fear, something primal that I couldn't explain. The floor beneath me cracked open, revealing a pitch-black abyss. Karen's laugh echoed around me, a sound so cold it made my blood run cold. "I told you, you're mine now." And then, before I could move, before I could even scream, I was falling into the darkness. The last thing I heard before everything went black was Karen's voice, clear and cold, repeating the same words over and over. "You're mine now." When I woke up, I was back in my own house. It was morning again, but the sunlight seemed dull, lifeless. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The air felt heavier, thicker, and as I walked to the window, I saw her, Karen, standing across the street, staring at me with those same wide eyes. She smiled, and I felt it deep in my chest, a cold, suffocating feeling. And then I understood. No matter how far I ran, no matter where I went, Karen would always be there, watching, waiting. Because in the end, I was hers, forever. I had heard the rumors about the woman down the street, but I never thought much of them until I moved into the house across from hers. She was a presence in our neighborhood, a woman named Karen, who was notorious for her demanding behavior, her need to control everything, and a certain dark aura that everyone who had lived here long enough whispered about. The neighbors would speak in hushed tones, mentioning strange occurrences tied to her. Disappearances, odd noises, unexplainable events, but I brushed it off as mere superstition. I was too focused on my own fresh start to be concerned about someone else's eerie reputation. My first encounter with Karen was completely innocuous. She came over to introduce herself one morning, a forced smile on her face that seemed to stretch a little too far. Her handshake was firm, almost painful, her grip lingering longer than I was comfortable with. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she had said, her voice a little too sweet. "We don't get many newcomers around here. I'm sure we'll get along just fine." There was something unsettling about her, but I dismissed it. After all, she was just a neighbor, right? But as the days wore on, I started noticing things. Karen would be there, always in the corner of my eye, watching from her window, her eyes following me wherever I went. It wasn't subtle. It was as if she was waiting, watching, studying my every move. At first, I tried to ignore it, but it grew more intense. I would go to check my mail and find her standing at her door, watching me with that same smile, her eyes always a little too bright. I could feel her gaze even when I wasn't looking directly at her, and it made the air feel colder, heavier, like something was always lurking just beyond my sight. Then the knocking started. It wasn't normal knocking. No polite little raps on the door. No calls from the porch to check if I was home. No, this was something different. It began late at night, a slow, deliberate knock that sent shivers down my spine. I thought it was just my imagination at first, or maybe the wind. But no matter how many times I checked the peephole, she was always gone by the time I opened the door. The knocking would stop, but the unease would linger, like the echo of something that shouldn't be. Soon, Karen began visiting during the day. She would come to my door, smiling that unsettling smile of hers, with an excuse that was always thin and unconvincing. "Just wanted to see how you were settling in," she'd say, but her eyes never left mine. They drilled into me, sharp and unblinking, as if she was trying to peel away my very soul. I could never shake the feeling that there was more to her visits than just neighborly concern. One afternoon, I returned home to find my front door wide open, the faintest creak echoing from inside. Panic gripped my chest. I had locked it before leaving. My heart raced as I stepped inside cautiously, the silence wrapping around me like a cold blanket. The house was undisturbed, yet something felt off. That's when I saw it. On the kitchen table, there was a small, faded picture frame. I didn't remember it being there before, and as I stepped closer, my blood ran cold. It was a picture of me, one I had never taken, one I had never seen before. I was standing at my front door, looking out, my face frozen in an expression of confusion. I didn't take that picture. I didn't even know when it was taken. My hands shook as I reached for it, trying to understand what it meant. That's when the doorbell rang. My heart skipped a beat. Slowly, I walked to the door, every step feeling like it was in slow motion. I opened it, and there she was, Karen, standing in the doorway with that same unsettling smile. "Oh, did I forget to mention?" she said, her voice dripping with something cold and sinister. "I like to keep track of all my neighbors. You'll be one of my favorites, I think." I froze, a chill creeping up my spine. Her words hung in the air like smoke, heavy and suffocating. "What do you want from me?" I managed to whisper. Karen's smile widened, if that was even possible. "Oh, nothing at all. Just your cooperation. You're the one who moved here, after all. Now you belong to me." I didn't understand what she meant by that, but I knew I didn't want to find out. I slammed the door shut, my breath ragged in my chest. But she didn't leave. I could hear her out there, standing just beyond the door, her footsteps slow, deliberate. I didn't dare open the door again. That night, I locked all the windows, every door, double-checked everything. The house felt suffocating, too quiet, too still. But I couldn't sleep. The strange feeling of being watched lingered, stronger than ever. It wasn't just Karen anymore. It was something else, something in the air. I was paranoid, sure, but the longer I stayed in the house, the more I realized how much she had been controlling without me even knowing it. It was subtle at first. Things would disappear from the kitchen, only to be found in strange places later. A picture on the wall would shift ever so slightly. The air would grow colder at night, even when the heat was on. And the whispers, oh, the whispers. I began hearing them from the walls, from the floorboards, low murmurs that I couldn't understand. Sometimes they'd grow louder, but always when I was alone, always when Karen was around. One night, in a fit of desperation, I decided to confront her. I had to know what was happening, what she was doing to me, to the house, to my life. I marched over to her house, my steps quick, my mind racing. But when I knocked on her door, no one answered. I pushed it open, and the smell hit me. A strange, acrid scent, like something decayed. The air was thick, the room dimly lit. And then I saw it. There, in the corner of the living room, was a wall covered in pictures, hundreds, maybe more. They were all of me, from every angle, every moment I had ever spent outside the house. She had been watching me, every second of every day, capturing my every move. And in the center of the wall was one last picture. Me, standing in my own living room, looking at the wall of photos, my face pale with horror. My heart hammered in my chest. I turned around, but Karen was standing there, blocking the door, her eyes black pits of emptiness. "You see now, don't you?" she whispered, her voice a low, bone-chilling rasp. "You were never meant to leave. You belong to me now. I've always known you would." The door slammed shut behind me. I tried to scream, but no sound came. The last thing I remember was her hollow eyes, a smile that never reached her face, and the cold embrace of darkness closing in around me.